Participation, time, and effort tonight. And Jeff, you may start.
Good evening, everybody. I just to make a quick comment, I hope that the folks that put this together understand they just gave a history professor the microphone. So I hope you've got some sleeping bags printed up. No, just as a real short intro to this, in my readings and studies and everything else, and I taught military history and all this stuff, I really had no idea what Spain did in the American Revolution. I heard some, read a couple of footnotes and stuff like that until I got here. And then I just was really blown away. I just kind of want to start out by saying that Spain played a significant role in the outcome of the American Revolution by providing economic support and opening war fronts to fight the British in both Europe and the Americas. Spain's support for the revolution was a strategic mistake for its government, however, because it was not in Spain's national interest to do so, and as a colonial power especially not. So, nothing here, like I say, what I'm trying to say is nothing, I got accused one time of, when I was talking about the Spanish, this was with some friends, over a couple of adult beverages, and somebody said, well, you're talking about the Spanish, how great they were, and you didn't mention the French. Okay, well, I'll mention the French here a little bit. Saying that everything I'm saying here is not, I don't want to take anything away from how the French contributed and participated and ensured our independence as a nation. The support that France gave was immense. However, we got this guy here that I say, and as I said before, war, while not decisive, Spain's contribution was significant. Some folks could argue, if I was to write a paper, I could actually write a paper saying it was decisive, but I wouldn't do that. I just pretty much want to say it was pretty important. It was pretty important. And both Spain and France actually worked together, even though, the interesting thing with Spain and France, those of you that are history buffs, you know that they're kind of friend enemies. They like each other and then they don't. And you talk to a Frenchman, they'll tell you that Europe begins at the Pyrenees. And then the Spanish will tell you that something else begins at the Pyrenees. And I lived in Spain for 6 years, so I got a chance to hear a lot of that. So, the fate of the colonies was very much, and this is the Chief Minister of the King of Spain. I got a couple maps here. And it's important to know what North America looked like before the Spanish War, we call it the French and Indian War, and how it ended. If you take a look at the second one, there's a couple of countries that kind of lost some colonies and some land. It was France and Spain, and they were more than happy to take out the English and to see if they could claw some of this stuff back. Spain wasn't all that excited about getting into the war, but once France decided they wanted to, they called upon the Bourbon family compact. It was just sort of an informal alliance. The Bourbon dynasty ruled both France and Spain, especially after the War of Spanish Succession that we commemorate here in St. Augustine because the British actually attacked us in 1702 during this conflict. And they laid siege to the city for the casino for about 51 days, and until they lose the battle, the British don't like to talk about it. So, at the start of the Revolution...
Sir, would you talk to the microphone more? I'm so sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, can you hear me now? Oh boy. Yeah, I got this green light's on. I got technology in my hand. I'm dangerous. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just do this. So at the start of the American Revolution, Florida was divided into East and West Florida, as I show on the map there. And this is the problem for the British. Because once the 13 colonies declared their independence, a lot of the support that they were requiring from Georgia and the Carolinas and whatnot, that pretty much stopped. And there wasn't a whole lot here in Florida to sustain them. And it was also important in the sugar plantations and everything else. The vast majority of the Spanish that were in North America are going to end up going to Cuba after the French and Indian War. Both Floridas are going to remain still solidly loyalist during the Revolution. During the Revolution, a large number of the British military was stationed in the Caribbean. Mostly, get my back up here again. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I got somebody said that. Okay. So anyway, pretty much, hopefully if you can kind of follow along, hopefully also by the PowerPoint. But this was the only masonry fort that was pretty much south of the Carolinas. And it was important to the British to do that, and also to keep it away from the Spanish. There we go. Put this back. Okay, is this better?
No.
So let's go to timeline here. So August 11th, British are calm, nice and calm here in St. Augustine, and they get word of the Declaration of Independence is signed, so it's become known. And immediately, the British, they build effigies of John Hancock and Sam Adams, and they set them on fire. And that's how they commemorate it and acknowledge the date. It takes place right here in town in the plaza. Both Floridas, along with Canada, were invited to the First Continental Congress. For some reason, East and West Florida decided they didn't want to attend. And in Canada, the British up there never asked the French. So they may have attended, they may have wanted to go. But anyway, Florida decided not to attend the First Continental Congress, and Georgia didn't either, but I don't want to get off on a tangent. Although the importance of Florida is usually ignored in history books, George Washington was very aware of the strategic significance of Florida. He's going to write a lot of notes, and he's going to recommend 4 attacks, but only 3 are actually going to be mounted. The Georgia militia is going to face these Florida Rangers and others, and they're not going to go, it's not going to go well for the Spanish. But there will be 3 attempts to take it. I'm dressed right now, I didn't mention this, I'm dressed as a militiaman. I could be either from Georgia or from Florida, East or West Florida. And this is just guy fashion for the day. And I'd probably wear a colored armband that would say exactly where I was. So, East Florida is going to be ceded to Britain, but most of the Spanish that are here are going to be going to Cuba. There's going to be a couple that remain. And I just want to, even though there were a couple other spies, I want to just highlight Francisco Sanchez. Because he had some substantial land holdings, especially north of town. And he's going to provide meat to the British garrison, as I said before. But the British are going to kind of regard him as an ally. When Spain joins the war, they're going to say, who is this guy? So, he's essentially going to be buried here in town at the Tolomano Cemetery. And I think it was about 8 years ago or so, the Spanish army came down. And we came over from the Castillo dressed up in our 1740 Spanish kit. And we did a memoriam there at the funeral site. At the war's end, the prisoner's going to be received. I think it's old hat here. I think everybody knows the history. There were 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence that were here for a while. And eventually, when they get out, Sanchez is going to give them a boat, fully provisioned, and let them go home, back up to South Carolina. So the conflict is now going to be worldwide. And you can see in the world where this conflict that Spain now is involved with the British is going to be in North America, Central America, South America, and Europe. How many of you know that Spain and France wanted to invade England? I didn't know that. Well, they wanted to. As I say, there Spain and France invaded, almost. What they wanted to do was essentially send a combined armada in 1780 and 1779, and what they wanted to do was land on the Isle of Wight and capture the Portsmouth Navy base. There were very few British soldiers, and the British fleet was off doing other things. So Britain, and there was no secret. What the French and Spanish did is they had 2 75-year-olds in charge. And shall we say that these 2 75-year-old French and Spanish generals were actually, when they were younger, were probably about the best of the crop. But shall we say, they matured, things weren't done exactly probably the way they would have done it 20 years earlier. And a whole comedy of errors, and some things happened, and it just didn't quite turn out all that well. No fleet battles were fought. Most of the folks that are going to die are going to be Spanish on ships and French on ships, going to die of disease. And soldiers are going to be starving and stuff in France, waiting for the Navy to come get them. And it just didn't work out too well. The invasion didn't happen. If it did, there's a good chance, from what I've read, that the Spanish and French would have captured Portsmouth, Isle of Wight, and probably could have marched on London. Think how that would have changed things in 1779. So let's go back to 1776. Spain wants to essentially show support for the Americans, but they don't want to be public about it. Why? Well, they've got a bunch of colonies that are still in Central and South America and in Mexico. And the last thing they want is to be seen to be supporting a revolutionary movement. So Spain and France set up a shell company. And probably all of us did when we were kids or doing our reading, we read about the thousands of muskets and the tons of gunpowder and cannons and everything else that went to the Americans. Well, guess what? About half of that was paid for by the Spanish. The Spanish didn't want to send Spanish muskets, Spanish cannon, because that would put their fingerprint on the war. So the Spanish essentially utilized French industry, and the French are more than happy to take Spanish money and make stuff. And this stuff, so if you take a look at all and I got a little list that's coming up here, about half of that stuff was essentially sent by the Spanish to pay for it. Spain's going to open all their ports to American shipping. This is important because Spain wouldn't allow any foreign ships into any of their seaports because they wanted monopolies. They're going to open it up to the Americans. The Americans could engage in commerce in any Spanish port in the Americas or Spain, or the Philippines, wherever the American happened to show up. Spanish ships are going to start arriving in New Orleans, bringing supplies and munitions, because my colleague is going to be going in a bit more detail on General Galvez and everything else, so I'm going to kind of leave that alone. But the Spanish understand that they want to take out Florida, and they need to start out with Mississippi, and then they need to get over and take out Pensacola, and then eventually St. Augustine. So they started bringing troops and equipment into New Orleans. And Bernardo Galvez, who I think everybody probably has heard of him, he arrives to take over. This is the Spanish assistance that was given to the Americans from 1776 to 1778. All that material, all that stuff is made in France. It's got the French stamp on it. The British actually got word about this, and the British knew about this all the time. And it got to the point where the Spanish told the Americans that were working for Benjamin Franklin in Paris that you need to come to Spain for us to actually talk about this stuff, because the British spies were getting too close to what was actually going on. So the Americans that were in Paris, working in, or I guess you'd call it an embassy, had to go to Spain to essentially work out a lot of these shipments. Franklin is also going to note in a report that there are a bunch of gunpowder waiting for him, that we shipped in 3,000 barrels of gunpowder for the Spanish to use in their efforts in the South. 1777, fundraising begins in Spain for the Americans. I served in Spain in our embassies I spent 2 tours in our embassy in Madrid as a military attaché. And I can tell you, if you kind of look at you bring up this up with Spanish historians, and they start making sounds. We start talking about how the Spanish viewed the English back then. So they're not too happy, but the Spanish are raising money to buy all this material and supplement stuff coming from the royal, shall we say, chest. Galvez is going to be essentially supplied and bankrolled in the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Who was Louisiana at this time? Spain. When I teach history here, and I always get to this point about the Louisiana Purchase, and I have my students, they go, why do you have this time frame, you have Spain and Louisiana? I said, no, it's going to go back and forth a couple times. But during the American Revolution, Spain is going to own Louisiana. Fort Pitt. Who's heard of Fort Pitt? The Ohio River Campaign. There's a good chance that would have been captured by the British if it wasn't for the Spanish. Fort Pitt, the Spanish are going to send supplies from New Orleans up to St. Louis, owned by the Spanish, and then from St. Louis down the Mississippi River and up the Ohio Valley. They're going to keep Fort Pitt supplied Without that supply run, the British would have captured Fort Pitt very quickly and freed up a whole bunch of British soldiers that could have been used elsewhere. I didn't know this stuff until I started digging into it. Okay, I wasn't taught this in school, so even college, university, wasn't taught it. So, 1778, France and the U.S. are going to sign a treaty. And and part of it's going to be the supplies and everything else. Spain in 1779 is going to declare war on Great Britain as an ally of France. Spain declares war on Britain not as an ally of the United States. The United States is left out of it. They're joining because France says, as part of the Bourbon family compact, this informal alliance they have, you must declare war. So Spain's going to declare war on Great Britain, and Spain is going to be careful not to operate in what is known as the 13 colonies. They're not going to have any of their troops there. They're eventually going to send 11,000 soldiers over that Bernardo Galvez will use, and they're going to be operating in the south, and there's going to be more Spanish soldiers operating in what is now the United States than there were French soldiers. A little trivia thing. So, Galvez, and I'm going to say I'm not going to get too involved in this because my colleagues are going into Galvez, but I got it up there to show that the Spanish army was a very multicultural, as we would say today, this kind of form. So then they're going to do the British, they're going to attack the British formations in the south. Who knew about the Siege of Gibraltar? I got a couple of hands go up. Glad to hear that. I'm not surprised. In the same war that the British are in the War of Spanish Succession, they're going to capture Gibraltar, and they're going to keep it. The Spanish want it back, and they're going to lay siege to it. The Spanish should have won this, but it's great. I could spend a whole lecture talking about how the Spanish were they messed so much stuff up, you're not going to believe it. But they're going to lay siege to this, and this is going to draw British soldiers and navies and fleets and everything else away from the Americas and away from the Americans. Obviously, the British do not want to lose Gibraltar. This is going to be the largest battle in the war if you put the number of the combatants, of sailors and soldiers involved. And I have no problem at all wrapping this into the War of American Independence. 1780, of course, Galvez moves out of Galvez, captured Pensacola. I'll leave it to my colleague to go through all this. 63 British ships are going to be captured by the French and the Spanish. And King Carlos III of Spain is going to put a tax on all of his colonies and Spain to pay for this war against the British. Help pay for it. Here we have St. Louis. Who's ever heard of the Battle of St. Louis? Well, when the British found out that all these supplies go into Fort Pitt, also the Spanish sent a couple of raiding parties into the Great Lakes and burned a couple of forts in Indiana. How many knew that? Yeah. Well, anyway, the British found out about this, and they said, we got to take out St. Louis. And this is kind of a diorama for a museum in the city. And it was like about a 3-story masonry tower with a couple cannons on top. There were probably about 30 Spanish soldiers and about 120 militia. And a number of those militia were French soldiers that stayed on in Louisiana. And when the Spanish said that the British are coming with their Native American allies, these French soldiers said, we're not so sure. But then they said, they're bringing the Native Americans and the British soldiers? Yeah, we'll join you. So the French, these seasoned veterans, they're French, they're farmers now, they joined, and the Spanish actually end up winning this. So this Battle of St. Louis keeps St. Louis in the war, allowing that resupply for Fort Pitt, and also making the British take care of the Great Lakes, because they're concerned about Spanish raiders. So, I went to St. Louis, and I wanted to see where this took place. So I started asking around. And I ended up to the History Society, and they said, go to the Starbucks on this street, and there's a plaque where that thing used to be. And I volunteered to Castillo, and every time I see somebody from St. Louis, I ask them if they know about the battle, and they sit there, and most people don't know what I'm talking about. And one day I ran into a woman who works for the Historical Society. I said, oh yeah, I know all about that. So I said, well, how come you guys tore the tower down? How come you tore the tower down? And he said, well, it was torn down in the 1880s as urban blight. And then somebody built a big department store. But the plaque is there, so if you want to go see what this used to be, it's at Starbucks. Yeah. So, the final Battle of Yorktown. How many know that the Spanish bankrolled Washington's march to Yorktown? And the French march? Spanish paid for it. French said, we don't have any money available, so guess who had money? It came out of Cuba. So Spain's going to bankroll Washington on the Yorktown campaign. Also, Spain's going to provide the French Navy with money. The French Navy in the Caribbean, de Grasse, those of you that know about the campaign, the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, Admiral de Grasse won that battle. French ships were kind of in bad shape because they were in the Caribbean doing kinds of things in storms. And when de Grasse got the word he needed to go to the Chesapeake Bay, he said, I need to get my ships refitted and stuff like that. I don't have any money to supply them. Spanish said, we got a little bit of money. And then the Spanish admiral goes and talks to the governor in Havana, Cuba, and they get all the rich plantation owners in Havana together, and they come up in 6 hours with enough money to refit the French fleet. So the French fleet is refitted. The French have responsibilities in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. So de Grasse goes to the Spanish admiral, his counterpart, and says, can you give me about 4 ships of the line, kind of like battleships, and some frigates, some smaller ships, because I got to leave mine here because I have responsibilities. And the Spanish admiral said, nope, we will assume all the responsibilities you have. You can take your complete fleet that's here in the Western Hemisphere up to the Chesapeake Bay. I think we all know the outcome. Spanish paid for it. And the Spanish assumes French responsibilities in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So now the French fleet was free, de Grasse goes up there, and of course we all know the whole outcome of this, or the decisive battle, and the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay. The English were not expecting as large a French fleet, those of you that studied the battle, as it showed up. And these French sailors were tanned, rested, and ready for the battle, and their ships ready to go. And thanks to Spanish money paying for Lafayette and Washington, the Continental Army arrives in time, and of course we all know how this thing turned out. So, Yorktown, the Battle of Yorktown, we all kind of know about that. It is Yorktown. Cornwallis was essentially forced to surrender. And I want to finish up here by saying that during the last presidential administration, a lot of us were very happy when former President Biden and the Secretary of the Navy decided to name one of its new class of warships after General Galvez. The only problem was that the whole program was a mess, and the Navy junked it all. What they did is they took a Danish ship design. My Navy friends told me this. They took a Danish frigate that was made in Denmark, and the idea was it was such a good ship that the U.S. Navy was going to use it. But then it got in the hand of Navy architects, and the Navy started making all kinds of changes, so it became a Frankenstein of a ship. And it was about way over budget, and finally it got canceled. How many of you know that General Galvez is an honorary American citizen? There's only about, there's not very many of them. Was there about 10 or so? Yeah, he's made an honorary American citizen. In fact, there's a portrait of General Galvez that sits in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee room. Anyway, I don't think probably a story. Anyway, but it's and that's a little bit about my little pitch and how I kind of look at the world here. And in Spain, when I was talking to my Spanish historians about this, most of the Spanish didn't know about this either. Because, but there were certainly a lot more than Americans. I had no idea. So I want to thank everybody for your attention. If I put anybody to sleep, please kick someone next to you. And thank you very much.
Sit down. I can't stand like I used to when I was a young man. I'm gonna talk to you about it if you don't mind. There we go. Testing. Now? Oh, hey, there we go. Well, thank you for coming tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here in St. Augustine. My name is Tom Hand, and I'm the founder and creator of a little American history website called Americana Corner. And if we can get the slides started. Oh, there we go. Good, thank you. We cover America's first century in chronological order. Right now we're covering the War of 1812, a fascinating war. And each Tuesday we put out a short story about 1,000 words and a short 4-minute video on Friday. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, please check out Americana Corner. It's kind of my retirement gig. I had a cheese company in Wisconsin. Makes sense, like, what else do you do in Wisconsin but make cheese and cheer for the Packers? Shar and I sold that business in 2019, and she told me to do something for myself, so I decided to start writing American history. It's been a lot of fun. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the things Jeff's already touched on, the role of Spain in the American Revolution. And by the way, I think it's very unfair. Jeff, where are you?
He left.
It's not fair. Look at this guy's hair. Look, it's like two extremes. How's that work? I don't know. But anyway, I learned a lot from Jeff's talk, and we're just going to kind of build on that a little bit. To understand the American Revolution, I think you have to go back to, let's see if I can do this right. There we go. We need to really talk about North America in 1776. And to understand North America in 1776, you need to go back to something called the 7 Years' War, which is really an international war fought largely between England and Prussia against France and Austria. And Spain came in at the end. And this is what North America looked like in 1776. But in 1763 is when all this happened. Prior to that, British Canada was French Canada, and British Florida was Spanish Florida. So the British essentially drive the French out of Canada. I think most people are aware of that. They capture Havana, Cuba, which is the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. And so at the end of the war, they do some horse trading. Great Britain wants to have more of a continental empire, so they trade Havana for Florida. Pretty good trade. Both sides benefited. And so that's where things sat for about 13 years. And then this little thing happened called the American Revolution. You probably all have heard of that. And Spain and France saw a chance to get back some of what was taken from them in 1763. And remember, Spain wasn't doing this, and France wasn't doing this because they loved America. This idea of democracy is just antithetical to absolute monarchies. And see, those guys hated what we were doing. And as Jeff talked about, Spain was the largest colonial empire in the entire world. And so they couldn't come out and support us for fear that their colonies would get the exact same idea, which they did, and in the 1820s they all rebelled. And so anyway, they see a chance to help us, hurt Great Britain by helping us. And so this is what the continent looked like. Then enter, let's see if I get this, there we go. Okay. So now, 1776. Everybody knows about what's going on in the East. They taught that in all the history books. Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, siege of Boston, Washington doesn't do well around New York, retreats across the Jerseys into Pennsylvania. Famously crosses the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, defeats the Hessians at Trenton, goes back across the river, does it again about a week later, goes and beats the Brits at Princeton, the so-called 10 crucial days. And by the way, if you've never been to Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania, each December they reenact the crossing. It's just the coolest thing ever. They even let me dress up this year to do the crossing. And anyway, it's a lot of fun. But anyway, and so everybody knows about this stuff. But while this is happening in the East, there are guys out west on the other side of the Appalachians in Kentucky, a county of Virginia. And one of those guys was George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark came from a great family. John and Ann Rogers Clark had 10 kids, 6 boys, 5 of whom served as officers in the United States Army during the American Revolution. There was only one who didn't, and that was because he was too young. And his name was William Clark. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because he was the other half of Lewis and Clark. And so, quite a family. Anyway, George ends up in Kentucky because he was going to school for about 2 months back home in Virginia. His dad hires a tutor, finds education very important, hires his oldest son. So he hires a tutor, and after about 6 or 8 weeks, the tutor calls John in and says, you know, Mr. Rogers, Mr. Clark, this isn't working out. George just doesn't want to be here. I think you should put your money someplace else. So he essentially gets fired from school. So George and his dad figure out, what am I going to do? Well, he wants to adventure out in great wilderness somewhere. So he decides he's going to become a surveyor, and he goes west to Kentucky. Well, while the war is going on in the East, Clark gets this crazy idea to invade Quebec. Now remember, Quebec at that time was on the north bank of the Ohio River. So when you're standing in Kentucky, you aren't looking at Indiana. You're looking at Canada. They extend all the way down. And George Rogers Clark had this crazy idea to invade Canada, except he had no money, and he had no soldiers, so it made it a little bit tough. So he goes back east to Governor Patrick Henry, and says, got this great idea, Governor. Me and some crazy guys from back in Kentucky are going to invade Canada. What do you think? And Patrick Henry says, great idea. Wish I could help you, but I can't. You have no money. If it works out, let me know. So he goes back to Kentucky, and he starts connecting with a guy in New Orleans named Oliver Pollock, another one of those great unsung American heroes. Pollock was an Irish immigrant. Comes over to Philadelphia in 1760. Loves the country, sets up a merchant shop in Philadelphia. He takes his business to Havana and eventually to New Orleans. By 1776, he's the richest man, wealthiest merchant in New Orleans. And he decides he wants to help Clark with weapons. And so Jeff covered that detail great. I won't go into all that again. But just know that the supplies that Clark used to invade Canada came largely from Oliver Pollock, his own fortune, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So anyway, Clark goes back and says, okay, guys, somebody's going to bankroll us. What do you say we invade Quebec? And somehow he gets 175 other young, crazy men to say yes. And they start rowing down the Ohio River. They cross at Fort Massac. I'm so busy talking, I'm forgetting to change these slides here. Let's see. So anyway, they go across Fort Massac and they show up at a place called Kaskaskia. There's 2 British forts on the Mississippi, Kaskaskia and Cahokia. They show up at Kaskaskia on all days, Independence Day, 1778. What's the chance, right? And they take it without a fight. They're all sleeping. They're thinking no one's going to come in and attack us. They take the fort without a fight. They go up, they do the same thing with Cahokia. So this is the summer of 1778. Well, by now, word has gotten up to Fort Detroit, which was the main fort for the British in that part of the world. And a guy named Henry Hamilton, Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, also known in history as Hamilton the Hair Buyer, because of his propensity to buy American scalps from the Indians. This guy, quite a guy, he taught his Indian allies to go out collecting scalps and he paid them for them. And so this guy's Lieutenant Governor of Canada. He goes down to Vincennes and he sets up a place called Fort Sackville. And he figures, okay, in the spring of 1779, I'm going to go take care of Clark. And he beds down for the winter. Well, he didn't know Clark. If he did, he wouldn't have rested so easily because Clark starts out and completes one of the great marches in American history, his march to Vincennes. Now, they were 200 miles away, dead of winter, the rivers are flooding, and so for the most part, they're walking for 3 weeks, soaking wet. They have to cook their food if they can find firewood that they can burn. And as you can see, they're not exactly dressed in LL Bean gear. They have buckskin, they have woolens, and they have homespun, and they wrap themselves as best they can. They're in waist-deep water a lot of the times. They had no boats. And if you know the geography, there's a lot of rivers. They're all swollen. So they have to build little dugout canoes and cross one at a time. It just took forever. So 3 weeks to go 200 miles. They finally make it. They show up and they attack and they surprise the British. They can't believe that it's happening. Actually, at the evening they attacked, Hamilton was sitting having dinner with a captured American captain, and he heard all this gunfire. And he says, "What in the world's going on out there?" And he says, "I think he's just been surrounded by George Rogers Clark." And it's what happened. Clark shows up. He tells this Henry Hamilton, that if he doesn't surrender, then they're not going to take any prisoners. And Clark probably meant it. And so the British surrender. And so now the British are out of essentially what became the Northwest Territory. As I said, this territory was huge. It's 300,000 square miles, almost 200 million acres. And it was captured by 175 guys. That's crazy. That's how they did it back then. And so now enter Bernardo de Galvez. While all this is happening up in what became the Northwest Territory, de Galvez comes in as the governor of Spanish Louisiana. And de Galvez wants to take back Florida, not for us, but for his own country. Makes sense. And he's a career soldier. He went in the Army at age 16. He served in theaters in Europe, in the Indian subcontinent. He even fought the Apaches when he was in New Spain, which is Mexico. And he sees an opportunity here. Garrisons held by the British are lightly defended. And he goes and he starts to invade them. And that's the Gulf Coast Campaign. As you can see, the first year, 1779, he takes Fort Butte, Baton Rouge, and Fort Panmure, also known as Natchez. The next year, he takes Mobile, after the Battle of Fort Charlotte. Then his crowning achievement, 1781, he takes Pensacola. Some great images from Galvez at Pensacola, on the battlements, and again. And so, because of Spanish support, as Jeff alluded to, the American Army was supplied with musketry, with gunpowder, and with money. Because of Spanish support, Clark succeeded in what became the Northwest Territory. And by the way, the second largest acquisition by conquest in American history after the Mexican-American War. Again, most people never heard of George Rogers Clark. Galvez takes Florida back. Why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because it's something Jeff alluded to. Instead of having Great Britain in the north and Great Britain in the south, we now had an outlet to the south if we could take Spain, or Florida back from Spain. Spain was a weak country and a declining empire. And over the course of about 20 years, we forced them to sell us Florida. It's unlikely we could have made England do that to us. So it's really important that they took Florida. Now, I want to talk a little bit about our three heroes. Oliver Pollock, I couldn't find a picture of him. Galvez and Clark. What happened after the war? It's not a pretty picture for any of them. Pollock goes and to Congress asking for reimbursement for what he spent. And Congress, being Congress, said, we're not paying you. The war is over, we don't need you anymore. They don't pay him. The creditors come after Pollock and they throw him in debtor's prison for 2 years. His friend Robert Morris bails him out, and but he's basically penniless and he dies a poor man. De Galvez, he's named a count and gets promoted to the vice regency of New Spain. But 2 years later, he dies in a typhoid epidemic. So within 4 years of his great victory, he's dead. George Rogers Clark, pretty sad tale. He's given a land grant of 150,000 acres in southern Indiana. He applies to Congress to have his debts be paid. Congress says, no, we don't need you anymore. And so he starts selling off all his property. He ends up with just 8 acres. 150,000, that's all I had left. He's a bitter man. So fast forward a little bit to 1793, and they have a revolution going on in France. And revolutionary France is not a big fan of George Washington or vice versa. And so revolutionary France sends over a guy named Edmond Genet, called Citizen Genet. Have you ever heard that name? He comes over stirring up trouble. And one of the guys he tried to stir up trouble with was George Rogers Clark. I usually don't talk this much, my throat's getting scratchy here.
Take a drink.
What's that?
Take a drink.
I think I'm lame. A whiskey?
Yeah.
But anyway, so the Citizen Genet names Clark a major general in the revolutionary French army of the Mississippi Valley, except there is no army. And he tells Clark to raise an army, so Clark starts doing this. Well, by now, Washington's fed up with Genet, and he orders him to go back to France. And unfortunately for Genet, his party in France has fallen out of power. And in revolutionary France, when your party lost power, you didn't just lose power, you lost your head in the guillotine. And so all of a sudden, Citizen Genet just loves the United States. He can't get enough of it. And he begs Washington for asylum. Now, if it had been me, I would have said, go back and face the music. But Washington, being the magnanimous man that he was, says, okay, you can stay. So this guy, who was trying to sell out the United States, goes north to New York, marries Governor Clinton's daughter, and lives for 50 years on a big estate, fat and happy, in New York, instead of going back to face the guillotine, all because of George Washington. Anyway, that's an aside. So Clark, getting back to Clark. He goes from bad to worse. He has a stroke. He has the misfortune of having a stroke right next to a burning fireplace. He falls in, burns his leg, gets amputated. Turns to the bottle, and from there things just went downhill. The guy's penniless, living with his sister in Kentucky. So it's that sad story. But anyway, so that's George Rogers Clark, one of the great Americans in our country's history, mistreated by Congress. It's almost a Benedict Arnold story all over again, but we won't get into that tonight, unless you have some questions on that. So, why does it all matter? Take a look at the map for just a second. Before and after. And a picture's worth 1,000 words, isn't it? Look where the boundary with Canada is. Look where it was.
Yeah.
we don't have the strongest country in the world on our southern flank, we have a weak country. And all of that happened because of Spanish support. So in my opinion, I think Spain had more to do with our independence than France. Nothing against the French, but that's my personal opinion. Anyway, that's all I have for you. I think, Jeff, you're going to come up and join me. We're going to do some Q&A.